Picture the scene. A heated moment on the pitch, two players nose to nose, the kind of confrontation football has produced a million times before. One player leans in, says something, and covers his mouth with his hand while he says it. At any previous World Cup, that gesture would have meant almost nothing. A bit of gamesmanship, maybe, the kind of thing a commentator might not even mention. At this World Cup, it can get you sent off. Straight red card, no second chance, no warning, just gone. That's one of the new rules quietly reshaping this tournament, and it's already got fans and pundits talking. So how did football end up here? And what does it actually mean for the players walking out under these new laws every single match? Let's get into it. This rule didn't come from nowhere. It has a very specific, very recent origin. And once you know the backstory, the logic behind it makes a lot more sense. Earlier this season, during a Champions League playoff match between Benfica and Real Madrid, there was an incident that football's lawmakers simply couldn't ignore. Real Madrid's Vinicius Jr. said he was racially insulted by Benfica's Gianluca Prestiani during the game. Prestiani denied the allegation completely, but here's the problem that incident exposed. With his mouth covered, there was no way for cameras, microphones, or match officials to verify exactly what was said. It became, as it was described at the time, a case of one player's word against another's. No definitive proof either way. Prestiani was provisionally suspended while an investigation took place, but the underlying issue remained unresolved because the evidence simply didn't exist. That single moment, replayed and debated for weeks afterward, became the catalyst for change. Because if a player can simply shield their mouth every time they say something controversial, the sport has no real mechanism for accountability. FIFA President Gianni Infantino addressed it directly not long after, telling Sky News that if a player covers his mouth and says something with a racist consequence, he has to be sent off. The International Football Association Board took up the issue at one of its meetings, and from there, it moved quickly toward becoming an actual law of the game. Here's where things get interesting, because the rule as written is broader than just the racism angle that triggered it. Under the new law, any player who uses their hand, their arm, or their shirt to cover their mouth while confronting an opponent will be shown a straight red card. Confronting is the key word there. This isn't about a player casually chatting with a teammate during a throw-in. It's specifically about moments of tension, nose-to-nose confrontations, the exact kind of scenario that produced the Vinicius and Prestiani incident in the first place. Think about what that actually changes for players who've spent their entire careers doing exactly this without a second thought. Covering your mouth during an argument with an opponent has been such a normal, almost reflexive habit in football for years. Players do it to stop opponents lip-reading tactical information. They do it simply out of frustration. Some probably do it because they've seen other players do it on television 1,000 times, and it's become muscle memory. None of that intent matters anymore under this law. If the gesture happens during a confrontation, the card comes out. There's no requirement for the referee to prove what was actually said. The covering of the mouth itself, in that specific context, is now the offense. This matters because it shifts the entire burden of the rule away from having to prove malicious intent and onto a much simpler, more visible action that any referee can spot from 20 yards away. It's a blunt instrument, deliberately so, designed to remove the exact loophole that let the Prestiani situation become unprovable. Now, here's where this connects to a second rule that arrived through almost the same conversation, and it's worth understanding both together because they come from a similar place. Alongside the mouth-covering law, IVAM also introduced a rule stating that any player who leaves the field of play specifically as an act of protest against a refereeing decision will be shown a straight red card. And crucially, that also applies to coaches who encourage their players to do exactly that. This one has its own very recent and very specific backstory too. It stems from the Africa Cup of Nations final, when the match was delayed by a walk-off after the hosts were awarded a controversial late penalty. The players from the opposing side simply left the pitch in protest. The match ground to a halt. Football's lawmakers looked at that scenario and decided they needed a deterrent strong enough to stop it happening again on the biggest stage in the sport. So, now, walking off in protest carries the same maximum punishment as the mouth-covering offense. And the rule goes one step further. If a team's actions force a match to be abandoned entirely, that team has to forfeit the match. Not a replay, not a points deduction to be negotiated later. A straight forfeit. Put those two rules side by side and you can see the thinking that connects them. Both are responses to specific recent flashpoints that embarrassed the sport on a major stage. Both are designed to close off a particular kind of protest or evasion that referees previously had no clean way of punishing. And both arrive at this World Cup specifically because FIFA and IFAB wanted these laws tested and enforced at the tournament with the biggest possible global audience watching. This is where it's worth stepping back and thinking about how players and coaches are actually adjusting in real time, because these rules were only finalized relatively recently, and a habit built over an entire career doesn't disappear just because a new law exists on paper. Several pundits covering the tournament's early matches have made the point that this is exactly the kind of rule that catches someone out almost by accident before everyone fully adjusts. A player gets frustrated in the heat of a World Cup moment, falls back on an old habit without thinking, and suddenly finds themselves walking off for an early shower in a tournament they've waited 4 years for. That's the genuine tension here. Nobody disputes the reasoning behind the rule. The discomfort is about how unforgiving it is for players who simply haven't fully retrained an old reflex yet. It's also worth being honest about the other side of the argument, because not everyone agrees the punishment fits cleanly. Some critics have pointed out that a straight red card removes any room for referee judgment about context or severity. Under the old approach, an official assessing a confrontation could weigh up exactly what happened and respond proportionately. Under this new law, the gesture alone triggers the most severe sanction available in the sport, regardless of whether anything was actually said that warranted it. That's a deliberate trade-off FIFA and IFAB have made, prioritizing a clear, enforceable standard over a more flexible one. And it's the kind of trade-off that tends to generate exactly this sort of debate once it's tested under real tournament pressure. So where does this leave the rest of the tournament? Both of these rules are still genuinely new, tested for the first time on this stage, and every match from here produces another data point on whether they're working as intended. The realistic best case is that players adapt quickly. The rule becomes a non-issue because nobody's covering their mouth in confrontations anymore, and football's broader accountability problem around unprovable confrontations actually gets solved. The genuine concern is that a marquee player gets an early red card for what looks, in isolation, like a fairly minor and instinctive gesture, and the conversation shifts toward whether the punishment was proportionate to the offense. Either way, this tournament is the proving ground. What happens here will likely shape whether these laws stay exactly as written, get softened, or get written even more firmly into the game for years to come. What do you think? Does a flat red card for covering your mouth feel like the right level of punishment to you, or should officials have more room to judge the context? And would you have preferred to see this tested somewhere smaller before being brought straight to the World Cup stage? I'd be genuinely curious to hear your take. If you found this rundown helpful, a like goes a long way. And if you want more breakdowns like this one throughout the tournament, go ahead and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is still developing, and as always, football never stays quiet for long. See you in the next one.